These sides are pushing up really, really strongly against each other.
Said there is a wall of separation that exists between the first table of the law and the second table of the law. Now that will come up again in our conversation.
Yeah. We have to stand for right because it is right.
Yes.
Hi everyone, we're in Rogera Williamsa Park. And why is this important and why are we here today? We're in Providence, which is in Rhode Island, and this city was founded by Rogera Williamsa himself. Providence holds a special place in American history because it was here that Williams established the first government dedicated to the principles of religious liberty and separation of church and state, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. Banned from Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1636 for his revolutionary ideas, Williams went on to create a society where individuals were free to worship according to their own conscience. Today, we're going to explore Rogera Williams' ideas and particularly his unique two-table doctrine and two-table concept that laid the groundwork for a true religious liberty as we have it today, and that is under fire right now. And I have with me Rona Meinhardta, and he's going to be going over some of this history with us at this beautiful park today. So Ron, could you give me a little bit of an understanding of Rogera Williams' approach and why this first took place?
Sure. Backing up a bit, we can give a little bit of a brief biography of Rogera Williams himself. He was a minister, but he also was a statesman. I believe he clerked with one of the most prominent lawmakers in Great Britain prior to coming to America and arriving at the Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony. But he had very unique ideas. And as you mentioned, these stem around the concept of religious liberty, because there was a recent emancipation, of course, the Protestant Reformation, an emancipation from papal tyranny. But unfortunately, because human nature is as it is, humans, when they get power, and even religious humans, when they get power, turn to tyranny or tyrannical measures again, sometimes to force conscience or to force certain behaviors. And Rogera Williams took a stand against that. He said we cannot be fully emancipated from papal tyranny if we're not willing to also show tolerance to others as well. And in fact, Rhode Island colony, Providence, where we are right now, was kind of the experiment, a noble experiment in which Rogera Williams was granted a charter to establish his own colony, and we'll talk about what led to that, his persecution from Massachusetts Bay, but a colony in which true toleration in religion could be experienced. Now, that being said, it wasn't anarchy, it wasn't a free-for-all. There were principles that were actually biblical principles that were put into place in which everyone still had to adhere to. But that's how we get into this doctrine of the two tables. And if I can go ahead and segue into that, just a brilliant nuance into the concept of the separation between church and state. In modern terms, we think of the separation between church and state as almost absolute. We think there could be nothing religious brought into statecraft. Well, Rogera Williams had a different view of that, and this was revolutionary at its time. He actually criticized, I believe it was King Charles, because he was grabbing land from the Native Americans, and Rogera Williams said, hey, this is not your land. You cannot claim this land in the name of God. This land was already colonized by these Native Americans. So he was a very much progressive thinker, but in a biblical construct. He was not departing from biblical principle at all. And in fact, he was reaffirming it. And this doctrine of the two tables was one example of this. Because what Rogera Williams said, he was looking at the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and he said, we have on one hand the first 4 commandments, which deal with man's experience with his God, right? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Don't create any idols, right? Even the Sabbath day, that's something that we have to be fully convinced in our own minds which day is the right day for us to keep in terms of the Sabbath, based on our understanding of the Bible. Now, Rogera Williams took those 4 commandments and relegated that to inalienable rights that could only be protected by government. So government protected people's rights to worship as they pleased.
Not force them to do.
Not force them, exactly. Now, on the other hand, we had the second table, which in this case would start with commandment number 5, honor thy father and thy mother, adultery. He said this table we will enforce through government. Why is that? Because it deals with man's relation with his fellow man. And even all the Enlightenment thinkers kind of got this. This was more of an agnostic or even atheistic thought process that man was naturally endowed, and many of them would go so far as to say by our Creator, even though they didn't worship Him, with these unalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. The famous philosopher John Locke was not the one who coined these things. We have Bastiat also, that there were certain things that were naturally given to man that no man had a right to take away from this individual. One of them is property. If you work to build a house, then another man doesn't have a right to go and take it from you,
Which we're probably going to run into these issues, and already some countries are.
Exactly. If a man marries a wife, his neighbor doesn't have the right to go and take the wife from him, Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not bear false witness, preventing slander and that kind of thing, or even giving punishment for these types of things. That is what government was instituted to do, to protect man's rights, but not to force man to worship a deity. So Rogera Williams, in his famous book called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, said there is a wall of separation that exists between the first table of the law and the second table of the law. Now that will come up again in our conversation.
Yeah.
He coined the phrase wall of separation. It wasn't Thomas Jefferson, as some people believe. Interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson had Rogera Williams' Bloody Tenet of Persecution book in his library. And we know during that time, libraries were very precious. If you had a book that you loved, that you really wanted to inculcate those principles into your own life, you would put that book in your library, and especially such an influential person as Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
So we know without a doubt that Rogera Williams' concept of the 2 tables of the law made its way into the principles that were given in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights.
And this is really why all the pilgrims left Europe, right?
Exactly.
It's because they were trying to get away from this religious persecution, this combination of church and state that caused them to be in so many difficult situations. Now, how is this still relevant right now? Why is this still like a novel concept for people that are living today?
That's a very good question. It's been said that history repeats itself, and some would say history repeats itself often. And we can see this, as you mentioned, the Pilgrims came over. They were fleeing religious persecution. They set up Massachusetts Bay Colony. It started to flourish. And individuals started to realize, hey, they're doing something right there. Let's go, let's move there. There's wealth to be had. There's lands to be gained. There's crops to be planted. So let's move there. And one of the premises behind Massachusetts Bay Colony was if you wanted to hold office, you had to be in the church. And so what that did was it set up an official church state for Massachusetts Bay Colony. And when that happens, you have individuals who will say, I really want to be in the Senate, so I'm going to say I'm a Christian, and okay, they can get in, but what does that do?
For political gain.
Exactly, and that waters down piety in the church. It brings in a mass of professions, but very little true religion. And when this happens, then you have people say, well, what's happening to our church? You know, what's happening to our colony? We need to start forcing people to pay their tithe and forcing people to go to church on Sunday. One of the first arguments that Rogera Williamsa got into when he came over, and he was given a congregation, and they questioned, why do we give this man a congregation already? He's already saying that we should not force people to worship on the Sunday. They should be able to choose whatever day they want to worship. That was one of the very first things he got in trouble with. And so we can see that this kind of thing can happen again. And there's a very distinct pattern that is alarming if we look at modern society, because we're headed right into that same area again. And if we don't understand what Rogera Williamsa took a stand for, and what our Constitution was geared for as well, and geared to protect, and the laws it was made to enforce, then we're very, very close to that Massachusetts Bay Colony experience again, which is not a good place to be. That is it's a reenactment of the despotism of the Dark Ages.
And how is this two tables grounded biblically? How is that connected biblically, and how is that beneficial when it's partially a biblical concept to the separation of church and state?
That's a very good question. We know the story when the spies, or was it a lawyer that came to Christ and said, who do we pay tribute to, you know? And Jesus said, well, give me that coin. And he said, who's on the face of that coin? And they said, Caesar. Well, Jesus said, well, render unto Caesar the things that are due to Caesar, and to God the things that are God's. That was that separation there. That's the wall of separation, that we're not to allow government to cross over. We had to take a stand. And you know, Peter and John, who said, we ought to obey God rather than man. In this area, we have to obey God. We can obey civil laws as long as they do not transgress the principles of God's law. That being said, though, there is that relegation of our divine interest, where we serve God with our own conscience sake. Government has no right to intrude. However, there's also that other table of the law. And as Christians, we also believe that's also binding on us. We're not going to kill. Even if the government says for us to go and murder someone, we're not going to do that. We're not going to go steal from someone, because God has still told us to do that. So there's an overarching principle. And that's why when the lawyer came to Christ and said, which is the greatest commandment? Jesus said, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy mind, all thy strength. And the second is like it, love thy neighbor as thyself, right? So he didn't give just one commandment, but it was this overarching, when we love God, we also love our fellow man. And so there's this overarching principle of obedience to God's law that supersedes any enactment that civil government could give. But that being said, good government will be patterned out after Rogera Williamsa two-table doctrine. It would protect the first table. It would protect man's rights to worship God as he deems fit, but it would also allow man to be protected by God's governing principles. Don't lie, don't steal, don't commit adultery, these types of things. If we look at that in a modern context, we can see that that would include things like, oh, that music is terrible.
I know. So we had a little bit of an intermission. You guys probably heard the music that was playing, so the lighting is a little bit different now, but it's still beautiful. So, Ron, how did Rogera Williamsa challenge really the status quo in the Massachusetts Bay Colony?
Well, I briefly touched on that earlier. Basically, he came over with different ideas, and there was a minister by the last name of Cotton, who was his archenemy. And in fact, they wrote numerous responses back to each other in the form of books even, where they were challenging this idea, or Rogera Williamsa was challenging the idea that the church had the right to force its, well, not the church, but the colony had the right to force its citizens to pay tithe and these types of things. And Rogera Williamsa said, you know, you can't do that because you are taking from a man who has potentially total animosity against doing such a thing, and you're showing him to be a hypocrite. You know, you're showing him to be this person who is willing to just sacrifice their own conscience to meld into yours, you know, and which is not right. It's not biblical. God doesn't do that to us. He says, come now, let us reason together. And so it shouldn't have been a revolutionary thought process because it's in the Bible. But there's something about human nature that once individuals get in power and they have this idea that their morality must be enforced on others, then we have this whole conundrum that ensues.
Forcing morality will fix morality, which is an immoral thing to do, which degrades morality.
Exactly. Now, that being said, Rogera Williamsa in his colony, and even there in Massachusetts Bay, did say the second table, let's enforce that. Let's keep people from stealing and killing and that kind of thing.
As long as it's affecting your fellow man.
Exactly. That's right.
And that's a big difference between what you do yourself and what you do that affects the other human being.
Exactly. That's right. Now, some would say, well, it doesn't that first table, you know, if someone doesn't go to church on the same day that I do, doesn't that affect me? Well, that is their prerogative because that is their decision with their God. Okay, now if we had our intermission because a group came up and decided they wanted everyone in the whole park to hear their music. And unfortunately, we had to bring about the second table of the law to kind of put that noise level down. It would be okay for them to listen to that music on their own. You know, if they had earbuds, if they want to go somewhere where they're not disturbing the peace, you know, there's a little bit different nuance to that. And there is some gray area, but thankfully, Rogera Williamsa said there is a wall of separation between, not there's a gray area, but there's a wall of separation. What is on that first table needs to stay on that first table and stay out of the hands of government, is basically what he said.
So did what Rogera Williamsa say affect the Constitution in any way and how that was formed?
There are some theories that state that there was no influence with Rogera Williamsa, that Jefferson even coined the phrase wall of separation. Now, I disagree with that because I do know that Jefferson, as I mentioned before, had Rogera Williamsa' book in his library. And Rogera Williamsa was a revolutionary thinker. I believe that his foundation of this place, or Providence, of the Rhode Island colony, sent waves that are reverberating even to this time in which we live. That's why these monuments are everywhere, celebrating his life, because we realize that he had a profound impact upon our country. And of that we can be very grateful for. So I believe God sent Rogera Williamsa to the Americas, and he gave him a purpose, and Rogera Williamsa was faithful to carry out that purpose, just as we are to be faithful in carrying out the purpose of continuing that legacy as well.
And how could or has been Rogera Williamsa maybe misinterpreted in modern times?
Okay, I think we have a lot to fear if we forget history. And if we're not studying history, if we're not studying the stance or the stand that Rogera Williamsa took back in the 1600s, then we can be liable to misunderstand what he was really meaning. There are two ditches that we can get into with Rogera Williamsa. Some say that he was a strict separationalist and there was no semblance of religion at all mixed with his governance in Rhode Island, which we don't see to be correct if we read his writings, because he had the two-table doctrines, right? He said religious liberty is here, but there's that second table of the law that we must hold as important for government to be responsible for. Okay? In modern times, we can get into trouble, and I believe we are in trouble right now, because when we say that there is to be no semblance of Christianity in the United States government, we're actually taking the Constitution and pushing out some of the influence that it could have. Now we know the First Amendment was there to protect that first table, right? What about the second table? Those are the laws that government was given to enact, to enforce whatsoever, right? The protection of life, liberty, and property.
And what's going to happen if that's ignored?
If that is ignored, and I believe that it is being ignored in this day and age, we will see a resurgence of a push to bring back both tables, because people don't understand.
And that's exactly what we see.
Exactly. You look at today where we have many violations of the second table of the law. We have abortion that is, we're not going to get into that today, but if you believe that you should not kill, especially if it's just, my decision to put an end to my baby's life because I just don't want to be inconvenienced, that is a violation of the law of God, right? We have the no-fault divorce that came about a few decades ago that allowed individuals to commit adultery and face no consequences, basically, or face little consequences, legally speaking. And so when we jettison these commandments, the second table in particular, from government oversight, what we find is that immorality increases tremendously.
So how can we balance then the religious versus civil freedom so that we have this proper structure that doesn't impede into people's freedom, but at the same time we still have legal justice and this security that why people left Europe and why we created this incredible new environment that we're in North America?
I think it comes down to this. I've been able to interview quite a few leading politicians, economists. I've been working on documentaries in my past, and I got to interview one libertarian who's middle of the road, moderate guy. And he said, Ron, and I asked him a very similar question. He said, Ron, what you need to do is get 10% of the population educated. And that's all it takes.
Wow.
You just get some people to learn these things and appreciate the fact that this country was founded to be a bastion for both civil and religious liberty and to protect those things. And they're enshrined in the Constitution. If you can influence enough people to become even self-educated, just pick up a Constitution. How many people have read the U.S. Constitution? Look at all the premises in the Word of God that show that we are to be obedient to the earthly magistrate, but not in things of conscience. If we educate ourselves, if we educate others, I think that will really help a lot. We look too much to force. Thomas Jefferson, famous quote, said that we need to, instead of forcing policies or laws or whatever, or opinions upon people, educate their indiscretion. And guess what? A lot of times people will make the right decision when you educate them.
Yeah.
And if you educate them, then empower them, encourage them. Now, that being said, there is something called federalism that is built into our Constitution, which means that there's a federal government, there are state governments, there are local governments, and there is personal governance as well. We need to empower the personal government, our governance. Too often we empower federal government to the neglect of personal government. And if we don't empower personal government, then federal government has to take a step in and say, look, you're not eating right, you're not doing this. We need to create more laws to force you to do this. So education.
And this gets to family education.
Exactly. Education is huge, and grassroots initiatives where churches are getting involved in this. There's a concept that I've learned. I'm taking graduate public policy at a fairly large university. And one thing I've learned that I found to be very profound is that there's something called sphere sovereignty. You see, the church has a sphere sovereignty over the matters of conscience. And the government has a sphere sovereignty over the matter of punishing crime, that kind of thing. The two, there may be a slight overlap, but there's that wall of separation that should be there. That should separate church and state. Now, that does not mean that the two are not working for a common goal of uplifting humanity, because they are, but each in its own sphere sovereignty. We need to keep those in their separate sphere. Otherwise, we're going to have this church-state combination that was characteristic of all the despotism in the Dark Ages.
So why is Rogera Williams' understanding interpretation still relevant today and right now?
What we see in society today is two things. We see rampant immorality, we could say, from a Christian perspective, but we also see a movement coming from that moral side, and I'd say moral side because it's not moral to do this, that says, look at all those people over there that are breaking the law, right? God's law. We need to, and I'm not talking about killing, the second table, I'm talking about the first table. But when you point to the first table and say, the reason why they're doing this is because they're not following the first table, therefore government must enforce both, that's where we get into trouble. And we could see that happen. You see, as the pendulum swings back and forth, we go to extremes. And unless we're there saying, look, I'm going to stand in the way, and if that ball hits me, then I'll take the brunt of it. But I'm not going to let this pendulum swing to where it shouldn't go. Yeah. And as those that know history, as Christians who know what it's like based on our past, based on the disciples' experience, based on people like the Waldenses and those that went through the Protestant Reformation, we know what it's like through their lives. We can learn vicariously. We don't have to go through that right now. And ideally, we should not have to. But there is going to be a push, and there already is a movement to force not only the second table, which is good, the government should do something about that, but also force the first table of the law, which totally does despite to all that Rogera Williams stood for and all that our Constitution stood for as well. How do you do that and still say that I'm a constitutionally minded American? It's not patriotic to enforce or to force people to pray, to force people to go to church, to force people to pay tithe, to force people to worship on a certain day. That's not a Christian principle. And this is going to happen again. We know based on prophecy, these things are going to happen, but we don't know when. One thing we do know is that we are called to stand in the gap and say, don't come this far because you don't want to go there. History tells us it's not a nice place.
Some people think we know it's going to happen, so just let it happen. Mm-hmm. The faster it happens, the faster we go home. Mm-hmm. But in reality, that's not right. We shouldn't want evil to happen because there's some benefit to us.
Exactly.
We need to be against evil, even if we think, if we do this, maybe this is going to happen. And,
yes,
we have to stand for right because it is right.
Yes, that's right. That brings up an important point as well that has modern relevance. And that is that we can get into trouble when we say, hey, I know it's going to happen. I know that there's a more conservative push and politically conservative push to make people pray again or these types of things, right? So let's side ourselves with the opposite pole and let's encourage violations of the second table,
exactly.
Which is the opposite extreme. And guess what? If we're doing that, we're giving fuel to the fire over here. What we should be doing is saying, no, we're going to stand there and we're going to be the wall of separation, because we need to protect religious liberty, but we do need to do something about crime. We do need to encourage government to do its job and to protect man's rights, these inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. But we cannot allow that protectionism to go into coerciveness in religious things.
And this is really important for right now, especially with what we're seeing in the government, what we're seeing with the political parties. These sides are pushing up really, really strongly against each other. And it's very religious versus very non-religious. And that's not what these parties should be about.
Exactly.
Right? It should be about policies and other things instead of religion versus a non-religious, if we could say that, side.
Exactly. And we see that there are so many inciting moments in the past 5 years even that have pushed the divide even further. We have a very small majority now of moderates, and maybe not even a majority anymore. It used to be, most people were more moderately minded. But I believe we can't allow ourselves to be pulled to the left or to the right. We need to stand there and be that wall of separation that says, this is God's principle of governance, and that is that we do protect and respect individuals' right of liberty of conscience, but we do not side with lawlessness as well.
Absolutely. I have actually a reference here that I would like to read. So this is from Uriah Smith back in 1887, and from a book called Marvel of the Nations. For the opposition assumes such an aggressive attitude that no neutral ground is left. An irrepressible conflict is precipitated. So we have two sides way too far on either side, and we have this huge conflict. It must be victory or defeat of the most decisive kind with either party. The government must become nominally wholly Christian, or in reality, wholly secular. So I thought that's very pertinent now when we're trying to force one side or the other, liberals on one side and the conservatives on the other, and these think they need to fight these, and then they push up against each other, and it just causes this complete synthesis and explosion in the middle, when we should be the ones in the middle. We should be the ones, like you said Rogera Williams was doing, upholding the second tablet governmentally, and the first tablet individually between us and God.
Yes, that's right.
So is there any last comments of maybe that people should be thinking about, especially right now with everything happening in the world?
There's one thought I would like to share and kind of close with this. It's a quote from a wonderful book called The Great Controversy. I know you've referenced it quite a few times in Truth Matters. And this is basically looking at Rogera Williams' colony, and also the good that could even be seen in Massachusetts Bay, because there were some good things that were practiced there. And this is what drew millions of people to the shores of America. And it's what made this nation great. And there is greatness still to be had, but it's not in making people pray. It's not in making people not pray, It's in realizing there are biblical principles whereby individual conduct is governed, religious conduct is governed, and personal conduct is governed. And to know which sphere and which appropriate action is necessary is vital to the continuity of our republic. So I'll finish with this quote. The Bible was held as the foundation of faith, the source of wisdom, and the charter of liberty. Its principles were diligently taught in the home, in the school, and in the church, and its fruits were manifest in thrift, intelligence, purity, and temperance. One might be for years in the dweller of the Puritan settlement and, quote, not see a drunkard, or hear an oath, or meet a beggar. The principles of the Bible are the surest safeguards of national greatness. And this shows that when biblical principles, when the second table is in the proper sphere of the government, is being upheld by the government, when the first table is held in our hearts, is encouraged by that sphere sovereignty of the church, and when the two are separated by that wall of distinction that Christ placed there to render unto God the things that are God's, and the thing that are Caesar's, the things that are Caesar's, when those things are done, we can live in a beautiful world. We really can. And we can make tremendous improvements in society, even with degeneracy, believe it or not. Now, if we don't do that, we are going to see eventually either total collapse into anarchy and corruption, or a tide that sweeps over us, which I believe, based on biblical prophecy, is going to happen, that sweeps over us and says, you must worship God in this way, you must worship on this day, you must worship this way, or else you will have serious consequences from our government.
Yes.
And this is to be avoided. And it can be avoided if we choose the better path just as Rogera Williams chose here in Providence, Rhode Island.
So thank you, Ron, very much for joining us here. And for everybody who's watching, we are in Rogera Williams Memorial Park. And keep this in mind, that church and state were designed to be separate, and that gives freedom for all, not just for a few people who believe it's their moral compass that needs to guide everybody else. And that's what these great nations were built on, is freedom of religion, freedom of worship. So if you like this, please make sure you share this video with your friends, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.